I'd like to thank you for coming to the conference. We really appreciate your interest and enthusiasm, and I think Sitka couldn't be a more appropriate place for this particular session, given the topic, which is Tlingit history during the Russian occupation of Alaska. And we are so lucky and grateful to have as our first presenters today two people that have dedicated their lives to the study of this subject, and to others as well, but this one has been particularly consuming for them over the past decades, and their work is nearly completed and will soon be available to all of us in the form of their new book. And that's something that I've been looking forward to ever since the first time I heard about it 20 years ago. I knew they were hard at work, and it was about ready to go to the printer at that point. And these things happen, but finally, after so long, it's going to be out, and I think everybody will be incredibly impressed with it. But I would like to introduce Nora and Richard Dauenhauer as our presenters today, and they'll be speaking on the Russians in Tlingit America.
Hi. The way Nora and I will do this, we're going to try and keep our presentation together under 20 minutes, so we can theoretically end almost on time if everybody goes about 20 minutes. As Steve said, this book that we are working on started actually here in Sitka, not only 200 years ago with the battles, but it was a Russian-American conference in 1987 in which we presented what we thought was going to be the introduction to the book. It's gone from there. So the good news about waiting 20 years to finish the book is that there's so much more that we didn't have 20 years ago, especially the Russian archives in the 80s were just very inaccessible and people weren't into them. Since then, the archives have been opened, and there are marvelous things, and I'll mention a few that have come out of the former Soviet archives that we wouldn't have had. The sad part about the delay is that so many of the elders have died, including the people that asked us to do this in the first place. And Nora's going to talk a little bit more about that, so I won't get into hers. And these are the people that had the answers to the questions that we now, only now, are beginning to ask the questions, and they had the answers, and they're not with us to answer them. So the moral of the story is work while you can. I'm going to start by referencing the catalog. The book that we're talking about, there's an ad for it on page 21 of your program, and it's called Anushi Tlingit Cut Russians in Tlingit America. And we hope that it'll be out in July. It's in the final stages. The cover is by Clarissa Hudson, who is one of the presenters here at the conference. I would also like to turn your attention to page 3 of the program, in memory of Lydia Black. Lydia was our co-editor on this. She did the introduction to the book, and she was responsible for most of the Russian translations, and then I sort of came along and proofread and Englished it a little. Unfortunately, Lydia died a week ago Monday. She was fairly okay until about November, and then December kind of went into decline and failed very, very rapidly, went into a coma, died. So we wanted to just remember her today. She was supposed to have been here with us. She would be our co-presenter. But in her memory, I'd like to read two passages that I think apply ideally to the work that we're trying to do. Lydia won an award for the humanities in 2005, and she was nominated by the Yakutat Museum in Kodiak, and I'll read what they wrote to her in nomination. Her outstanding scholarship, her knowledge of Russian society, her own personal connection to the Russian Orthodox Church have provided Alaska with unusually rich access to its heritage. She has given us forgotten and hidden pieces of our history, reuniting us with information inaccessible to most. Her work has significantly enriched the knowledge of Native Alaskan history, allowing Native people to reach beyond living memory into the daily lives of their ancestors at one of the most profoundly influential points in Native history. She will tell you that some academics have criticized her for not writing about the ills. Her response is, "My job is to remind them of their glory." And I'll stop with that. And then she mentions also Dr. Black's research on the Russian period of Alaska history has helped Alaskans to see Native societies at the dawn of Western conquest and understand both the traditional culture and the forces that changed it. For Alutiiks who seek to understand their heritage and to reawaken traditions disrupted by the conquest, Dr. Black's work is an unparalleled gift. So I just wanted to give those words in memory of Lydia. Another problem we faced in doing the book is we wanted to include material on Yakutat, but it was beyond what we could do. And so I'm very, very happy that Elaine and Judy have picked up that tradition, because as you know, the Battle of Sitka is quite famous. People don't know that much about Yakutat, but there was another attack at Yakutat, and it's a very important piece of history, but less well known, so we look forward to that. Okay, I'll spend about a few minutes, I want to go over briefly what's in the book, and then I want to talk a little bit about some of my favorite parts, and then Nora's going to talk about hers. What we tried to do in this book is we enter into the realm of what's called ethnohistory, which is where we deal with history both from documents that have survived in the archives, but also from living oral tradition. And so we have these two areas, and each of our books is focused on a different genre of Tlingit oral literature: narratives, oratory, biography. And now we get into history, and this is a very complicated project because the basic question is who owns history? And when you get multiple people who fought in a war, in a sense they all own part of that history. There was also a Tlingit tradition of not talking about an event, about a war after peace has been made. And there was a very important peace made in 1805. And so for a lot of the elders said, well, we really, it's disrespectful now to talk about this after the peace has been made. So these were decisions that had to be made pretty much by the community. And finally, the Kits.adi people gave the green light and said, let's finish this. We want people to know. And Nora's going to talk more about the heart of the book, which are narratives by Sally Hopkins and Alex Anders about the battle. But I'll give you a little bit of the skeletal overview. So the main thing we were trying to do in the book is present the Tlingit point of view. And this is the part that's been very often overlooked, because everybody knows or thinks they know about the Russian point of view. But we found, too, that there's an awful lot of stereotyping and oversimplification there. So it just wasn't the nasty Russians and the nasty Tlingits having this flare-up. It was very, very complicated. I can't begin to go into that. But the battle in Sitka was a very well-planned, very well-organized event. There were attacks on Russian positions in 3 fronts within the same time frame. It wasn't just a bunch of disgruntled people reacting. So anyhow, what do we begin with the book is we start with Mark Jacobs Jr., who gave a talk back in 1987, and we included his work all the way through the book of the early encounters between the Russians and the Tlingits. And we also have an account by Andrew P. Johnson of Sitka that his family found in the attic, literally in the just as we were well along on the book. And Steve Johnson cleaned up the tapes and transferred them to a CD. So we have 2 accounts by A.P. Johnson going through that give the Tlingit point of view. Then we begin with the first contact. So we have Chirikov contacting in 1741. and his men. One of the great murder mysteries, or I shouldn't say murder mysteries, one of the great mysteries of history, what happened to his men. And there's a very exciting adventure there where they went ashore to get water and never came back. And the second boat came out and was set out and never came back. We think we have answered the mystery. Our colleague Alan Engstrom believes that he has found the place where the contact took place, and we think he's right, and he's in the book. Then again, there were two additional encounters with the early explorers, one by the French, La Perouse, up in Lituya Bay, and then two Russians that people don't know about, and that's Ismailov and Bocharov in 1788. La Perouse published in French right away, translated into English instantly and became famous. Ismailov and Bocharov were not translated into English until the 1980s. So people don't know about them, but they were visited Lituya Bay a year after the French. Then we mainly worked with a lot of correspondence with Baranov, who was moving from Kodiak into southeast Alaska in 1792. They had their first contact with the Tlingits in Prince William Sound. One of the exciting things in the book is we have the documents from Russian, their account, we have the Tlingit oral accounts, and we also have artifacts in the museum. And this would be especially true for Yakutat, where Ismailov and Bocharov mentioned we went on shore, they give the names of the people from Yakutat that they met, they traded, and they say we traded this for that, and the Tlingit items are in the Kunstkammer Museum in St. Petersburg today, and we have the journals of the people, and so this whole thing becomes very, very exciting. Another early document we have is an amazing thing, never published, not even in Russian, also in English. Dmitry Tarkhanov was a Russian engineer who Baranov left behind in Yakutat with the Tlingits as a hostage. Now, they traded hostages, so he took some Tlingit kids with him, left Tarkhanov. Tarkhanov walked with the Yakutat Tlingits around the bay, or across the bay, then up through Eyak country, and up the Copper River. And there are place names all the way extending over to what's now Wasilla, and the people he met. And he came back, and he has a travel journal from 1796. This incredible first-hand accounts of his encounters with the Yakutat Tlingit and the Eyaks. And then we have a whole bunch of things dealing with moving into Sitka. Baranov had a wonderful ceremony marking the annexation of Sitka to the Russian Empire. He did his parade moving. He also buried a possession plate. And of all the possession plates that were buried, the Sitka one is the only one that's known. It was discovered in the 1930s, and it's here in Sitka. And Baranov describes in exquisite detail where he buried it, and it's been found. So we have all of these things together. Then, of course, the main thing, the Battle of 1802, we have the Russian accounts, we have survivors' accounts of that. And I'll talk for a couple of seconds, because one of my favorite characters is a bad guy from that, a guy named Henry Barber. And we believe Barber set the Tlingits up for this, because right after the battle, Barber comes sailing in on the smoldering ruins. The Tlingits gleefully, happily climb aboard, greet him like an old friend. He immediately slaps them in irons. He lynches one of the Tlingits, forces them to give back the furs and the hostages, takes the hostages to Kodiak, where he ransoms them back to Baranov at so many rubles a head, takes the furs and sails on to Canton. So much for Henry Barber. And then the next day, an American ship came in, and then another ship, and these guys had been wintering in Angoon. So there's all of this excitement that we never knew about before, but when you look at the ship's logs, you figure, well, what was this guy doing sitting out there in Angoon, just waiting? They all mysteriously appear in the smoldering ruins. There's another great side adventure here from Yakutat, where Kuskov was coming down, because they thought, well, we better check on things. They get as far as Jacobi Island, and somebody says, well, better go out and check out Sitka. Send them a Darka down, see the smoldering ruins, come back, go back up to Yakutat, because they figured the Tlingits were up to no good there, and they were just a few years early. So 1805 they got theirs. But there was a great battle at Dry Bay, and that's something that, again, is I can't keep talking about this. I get so excited. It's one of these great sucker punches of all time as the Tlingits attack, and then they go into absolutely flailing retreat, and then the Russians come charging after them, and the Aleuts, and then they get up to this little hillside, and the Tlingits unveil their cannon. And so the idea of these guys running around with spears is because the Tlingits outgunned the Russians right down the line, and so out come the Tlingit cannons, and then they open fire, and then of course it was the Russians and the Aleuts that turned tail and left all of their stuff on the beach. Basically got into their badaras and went through the breakers and got out of Dry Bay in a hurry. But that's then we continue with the Battle of 1804, and then the peacemaking. The stuff that Tom was showing this morning of Sitka Bay is very important because that was the site of Point Craven where the Tlingits retreated to. So in the book we also have Herb Hope's account of the retrieval or the retreat over there, the relocation. And then a lot of interesting things too. 1805, there were two gentlemen who were bunking in together in Sitka, a guy named De Wolf from Rhode Island and von Langsdorff, who was a German, and they left parallel accounts of what was going on. Von Langsdorff was kind of a grump, and he thought this place was the pits, and De Wolf thought it was great. And so you're reading the same events these guys are describing. Anyhow, they paddled by kayak over to Point Craven and back and described all the people they met along the way and having tea with the local Tlingits, and they had a good time. I'll just mention a couple of more things and then yield to Nora. What was so exciting to us was to find the degree to which the Russian accounts and the Tlingit oral accounts agree with each other. There are people mentioned in one of the written accounts from 1802. They mentioned a translator from Sitka named Anyushka. And in Sally Hopkins' account, she mentions Alushka, which is her Tlingit pronunciation of Anyushka. So we have the same person pops up. They mention in both the Tlingit accounts and in Lysyansky that when the peacemaking came, the Russians gave a medallion to the Tlingits put around their neck, and that exists in both of those accounts, plus there's one of those in the museum. We're not sure if that's the same one or an identical one. So that's exciting. Maybe the most interesting detective work is in all of the Tlingit accounts of the battle. There's a fellow named Giduk, who is the Aleut sharpshooter who was chased all over by the Tlingits, finally captured and tortured to death. And we now figure that his name, he was Vasily Kochesov, and we can tell by looking at the payroll stubs and how people came to an end. So you can take all the documents again and put them against the oral tradition, and we have the fellow named Giduk in the Tlingit oral accounts, and we have Kochesov. And we also know the name of the blacksmith that the Tlingits did in to get the hammer that Kasyan used in 1804. His name was Tochtin. So it's kind of exciting. But I'll yield with that because what was so exciting was that this is, to us, an entirely positive thing. You have the oral accounts and the written accounts supporting each other to an incredibly large degree. One other one I should mention, a very famous song that the Kits.adis to this day sing as a lamentation, as a dirge, Susan's song. And this is the account of this song is mentioned in all of the Tlingit accounts. It's also mentioned in Lysyansky, where he mentions on Wednesday afternoon at such and such time we engaged in small arm fire and the canoe blew up. So you have it in Lysyansky's logs, this encounter, and then it survives in Tlingit oral tradition, and there's a Kits.adi song to commemorate that. So there's an unbelievable support of each other. So I'll pass over to Nora, who's going to talk about her favorite events, and we'll you.
Good afternoon. Dick was talking about driving, and it's my mother's ancestral land, so I'm connected to driving. I'm happy to tell you that. And some of my Yakutat relatives are in the audience. Nice to see you. My part in the Battle of Sitka, getting it together as a book, was first transcribing. I don't know if you know what transcribing is. It's to take the language from a tape recorder and to put it on paper. And then after you do that, you have a job of translating. All your transcriptions of the history gets proofread by somebody like my husband, who's a linguist and knows Tlingit language and the alphabet and the different kinds of symbols that makes up Tlingit language. So my part was to do that original Tlingit language transcription. And then part of my part at the end was to proofread my own mistakes. Boy, they were hard. And Dick is a taskmaster, so he keeps coming back for, what do you do with this, what do you do with that? It was hard. And after translating, then we go into proofreading the translations, which takes just about the same amount of time as proofreading Tlingit. The difficult thing about Tlingit is it's so different than English. And the alphabet, I don't know how many alphabets we have. We have too many. I'm not going to tell you. Anyway, I really enjoyed transcribing Sally Hopkins because she had been gone from among us for quite some time when I was asked to do it. And the parts that really didn't feel good to me was the bloody parts of the passages of Tlingit description of the battle. But after a while, it started to be real good and made sense to me. And then before I started transcribing Tlingit, I got into Homer. I don't know if any of you know Homer's writing, the Odyssey, and what's the other one, Iliad. And I really liked this, is it Roman? Greek mythology. I really enjoyed it. And when I started to transcribe the bloody parts of the Battle of Sitka, I immediately thought of the Greek mythology. Odysseus, when he came home, he found that his house was full of suitors for his wife. They thought he was dead, so they wanted to marry her, and each were going to try and marry her, each suitor. And he killed them all, and his house was just bloody. And that's what Battle of Sitka reminded me of when they got into fighting. I'm really proud of Tlingits. They were fighting for their rights. And this I'm very proud of. And makes me think they were right on. They were fighting for their land and maybe their resources. Anyway, I'll leave it right there. What I'd like to do now, though, is to thank posthumously all the individuals who helped us to get this book together. Peter Nielsen, who tape recorded Sally Hopkins. Vesta Dominics, who transcribed Alex Andrews. Her transcription will be in the book. Lydia Black, who was the connection to Russia for us and to Russian literature. George Hall for taping Alex Andrews in 1960. A.P. Johnson's narrative of the battle in English. We thank all of these people for their help. And then Jacobs, Mark Jacobs, who also told part of the story. In 1958, Sally was recorded, and in 1960, Alex was recorded. I would like to take this opportunity to say that these two individuals, the technology was so new, and they weren't afraid to take the initiative and record their story so that we could discuss it today. It's really good. There's 18.2 and 18.4. It was wonderful to transcribe Sally Hopkins from the woman's Tlingit point of view. She was probably the name giver of her family, maybe of her house. She had many names that she recited on the tape. And today, once in a while, I come across some of the names that the younger Kits.adi have from her list of names. I liked that very much. And I really liked Alex Andrews. Only just the quality of his voice was so great. You'll probably hear it when we get disc made from his telling of the story. He tells it in Tlingit, not in English, but we'll have the English, so you'll be able to read that too. I really enjoyed it because it reminded me of the old timers that I heard telling stories. The voice, his voice was so commanding, and it was so easy to understand him. And I just enjoyed it. I loved it. I still do. This is a really good opportunity for us to write our stories. But, you know, our stories have been written for a long time. They have been written in many places, many countries. And we never said a word, we just read them. So, this is the first time we're saying something. And I'm very happy we are. And that's about all I want to say. Thank you.
One footnote, in my haste, I forgot to thank the National Park Service, who were the starters of all of this, because they were the people that tape recorded originally and said, gee, would you guys like to do this? And then secondly, especially the Kits.adi house leaders and the descendants of Sally Hopkins. So these people are among us today, the Andy Bona and his siblings, the Hopes, all of these people. This is not something that happened 200 years ago. They're alive, and without their support and their encouragement, we would have never done this. Thank you.
That was really a great introduction. Thank you so much for sharing that with us. And if you're interested in hearing more from Nora and Richard, they'll be the keynote speakers tonight at our banquet, starting at 5:30 back at Centennial Hall. And one of the things that really impresses me about Nora and Richard's work is how well they work together as scholars and are really a very important team and take a team approach at what they do. And I think that's really really great. And their books are among the most dog-eared books on my bookshelf. I have them right by my desk all the time, and I'm looking at them every day, and they're just tremendous resources. And our next speakers come from another family of historians and cultural experts in Yakutat, the Ramos family. I'm sure many of you know Elaine Abraham, George Ramos, Judy Ramos, and David, a family there that's working as a team and preserving history and researching it and writing it. They've produced some wonderful written accounts and articles, and I look forward to hearing the next two presentations. I'd like to turn this over to Judy, though, to introduce her mother.
Goodness, Chief Steve. I really been enjoying myself at this conference, and I really would like to give another hand to the people who organize it. It's been a really interesting lesson to everyone's presentation, and I have a feeling we're only touching the surface of what's there, because our culture is really deep and wide, and I think there's so much knowledge out there, and I hope we can capture at least a little bit before our elders pass on. And I'd like to introduce my mother, but I'll give you a little background. Growing up, she grew up in the traditional way with her parents, Olaf Abraham, who was a Kits.adi chief in the Yakutat area, and my grandmother, Suzie. Olaf Abraham, his name was Yan Ish, and we've adopted Yan Ish, so that's Will here. He's our adopted grandfather now. He takes really good care of us. I'm really glad to have him as our grandfather. My grandmother is Janat Tla. My daughter up there, who's helping record, just got her name, Wanka Janat Tla. And after growing up in Yakutat, she went to nursing in the Arizona area, and she had to stay away from home for almost over 5 years, away from Alaska. And then she came back home and nursed all over Alaska. And then she nursed for many years, and then retired from nursing and worked at Sheldon Jackson College and worked there, and then worked at University of Fairbanks, and then retired University of Alaska, and where she established the Native Student Program, the Native Student Services Program, the Native Studies Program. Along the way, she's got a linguistic degree, also a degree in education and Master of Arts in Teaching. But to me, really great, because now that she's retired, she's got more time, and she spends a lot of time teaching Tlingit to my children. So at this time, I'd like to introduce Chu Shaw, and she's got another name too, Yakutat.
You know how I feel what my mother and my aunties used to say, "Ya intashan ush." I have a hard time walking down that steps. goodness, geez, Professor, for the wonderful work you're doing. It's hard work, and I'm going to get into some of it. That translations is so difficult. I want to thank Steve and Andy, the volunteers who put these programs together. I wish we could do it more often. Raising the money is always a problem. I've got 2 volunteers up there. It was a hard decision for them to come. Yakutat was in Anchorage in the basketball madness, and last night the girls became state champions. Last year it was our boys, and my granddaughter, Janata, likes to play basketball, and my grandson too. So they had to make a decision, basketball or this conference. And they chose this conference, and now they're working for Andy. They're up there, they log in, everything we're saying, what's in the program, and they also have to translate some of the Tlingit, and they're going to have a hard time with mine. Mine is going to be heavily Tlingit. I want to recognize the Tlingit that are here. George Sam, my father's namesake, and I think there's a few Tlingit here. And I also want to recognize the Yakutat people, and especially Kits.adi, Nelly Lord Dastia. In Tlingit, when you're talking about warriors, you talk about the man that protects my back, because they're hand-to-hand combat they do. And Nellie doesn't know it, but that's what she was to me when I do those potlatches in Yakutat. Somebody's got to be there to set me straight. And I wonder, one particular one that was going on and on, 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. Finally, Dastia Nellie comes up to me and she says, the raven is going to call daylight on you. It's taboo to keep continuing. So I'm glad she's also Tlingit. Her dad and my dad are relatives. I have a dilemma all the time when I do this, because we are boxed into a Western way. And since I was brought up in a traditional way, it's really hard to be boxed. And I don't know how Professor Nora, do it, because they're called to conferences all the time. Traditional way is the introduction is usually done by Ihlilk. My Ihlilk would do my introduction of who I am. And they tell your genealogy, so it can take an hour. So it's really hard to do this in the Western style. That's number 1. Number 2 is, who is the owner of these histories? Who has the right according to the Tlingit protocol? You heard my sister Nora, they talked about the Kits.adi that they worked with, to work along with them and give them permission. Other times, who has the ownership of these stories? And the one that really, really gets us is the time limit. We can't do justice. You can just barely do an outline. And number 4 is the Tlingit language. There's some phrases in Tlingit that Tlingit is just not good enough for those phrases that you say in Tlingit. But it reminded me as I was traveling around in New Mexico, and I probably will tell it in Tlingit. And the songs were, oh my sweetheart, tonight you put on your moccasin and walk on my heart. Ooh-yah-hey, ooh-yah-hey. And she comes over, she said, I hear you can really translate things into your language. I really want to learn how to say it. And I thought about it, How am I going to translate this into Tlingit? I finally said, Yakutat Tlingit, ikishtili oste itayak, akatois kaklishi tatkama. And she said, that's kind of long. But anyway, then sometimes I know Nora feels like that too, and Nellie, it's so hard to translate things from Tlingit into English. And as I go along, I will cover some of these. I'm glad Judy keep going back on it. I'm glad Judy did some of my introduction. We really are Yakutat Tlingits from Copper River area. We came from Chitna to begin with, that's on my mother's side. On my father's side, the Kits.adi that came from over in Ketchikan area, that's where my father comes from. And I asked the question, who has the right to tell these stories? And that sometimes is a block to us. Do I have the right to tell this story? Sometimes it's a real hesitancy, because sometimes you don't have the right. So I had to, for a long time, keep all of it in my heart on what I was taught. But I have the right. Olaf Abraham was the Tlngit and Hendrikson. The land and the fort was on his grandfather's land. To Gush Kat Uwa Good he was brought up on the laps of his grandfathers in that land where that fort was. And the area belongs to the Raven clan, to the Hendrikson, and that's on my mother's side. And I was really fortunate as the youngest part of the Abraham family, that my brothers and sisters are all gone. Nora and I won't tell you what our ages are, but we're the young ones. And that's what's left. That is what is left now today that can really understand and translate these stories. They used to come to my house when I was young. Olaf Abraham used to sit there, and it was his brother-in-laws that came to see him. Then they would tell these stories like for 9-8 days in a row. And it was his brother-in-law, Charlie, that used to come and tell him these stories. Arlene's grandfather. That was his only sister's husband, Charlie White. And the other person was Harry K. Bremner, another brother-in-law, my mother's brother. And that is sort of the thread that the Tlingits used. The men used to stand together as brother-in-laws. And they used to go from day after day after day with these stories. And it was a balance to have 2 ravens and an eagle to be telling these stories. Because as you go along, you might forget something. And your brother-in-law has the right to say to you, I think you missed something. Or I think you left this one out. I think you went far ahead. So it was a balance that was able to tell these stories. I made an outline because it's too hard to try to stay in the part that we have to do in 10 minutes or so. So I made an outline so I won't get too far out and not end the story. I give credit to these 3 men and I give them the honor for the knowledge they left us. and they are the owners of the land where the Russian fort battle was fought. The third question I asked was the time limit. There is no way I can even get into the battle because Tlingit protocol is that we have to tell about the genealogy of the storytellers and the first person that comes up in your story, in your history. So I decided to focus on the warriors that fought the battle. There were many of them, and you don't hear about them because it's not written. Tlngit was the leader. He was Kits.adi. He was really of an Iyak descent. The warriors were Kits.adi, Kits.adi, and Kits.adi. There were actually one group with different names, and they were mostly Iyak, Akna, genealogy from thousands of years back as they became Tlingitized. Who were those warriors? What clan were they? And why did they fight? And why did they not surrender? They never surrendered. Tlngit is credited as the leader. Tlngit comes from the word Tan-u-hu, the tooth of a sea lion. And he was brought up in a traditional Tlingit manner for men to cut away the Shwak, another really sometimes a bit bad warrior that went up and down the coast battling the foreigners that were coming up and battling people to the west of them. Shwak was his uncle. They list him as Kits.adi, like I said, Kits.adi, Kits.adi, and Kits.adi were pretty much the same people. Shwak Jikawakutsiti we Tlngit. As soon as the young man was born, his uncle took him out to the rivers, to put him into the river, to harden him as a newborn, to harden him so that he will be able to face the hardships of a warrior. And later on, as he trained this young man at Yakutat has ulches nukjawe adusak shaha ikan kasu yayitat dushit uhaska de kakas yagnakas idid. Who will have pity on us? What spirit will have pity on us that this young man can become a warrior to revenge his mother's uncles and their grandmothers? And as a young man, and because this part is really important, I couldn't leave it out because that's the end of the story refers to this part. Our shutra way to cake. There's no word for that. I don't think it's a Spartan training that they have for young men. And I'm sorry, I can't explain that too. And he was just a young boy. And the reason why I can't leave it out is at the very end of the battle of this famous warrior, he also, as a young man, he sought the spirits for strength again. And in Tlingit, they say they cut the tongue of the spirit that comes to them. And that becomes your spirit that guides you and gives you the strength that you were asking for. So when they come to this part of the story, I still remember little Charlie White and my Uncle Harry Brimley. My father would tell the story while the men gave him the encouragement, correct and correct him, and the two uncles, they would be shaking their heads because it's kind of taboo to the way they charmed this young man. As he grew up, his uncle would put him into any of those ships that were passing were North Coast people. And they would put him on so he was able to speak Iyak, Tlingit, Aleut, Chugash, and eventually he spoke Russian very well. And when the Russian, I'm skipping maybe 2 days story, when the Russians came to Yakutat, he offered his services to the commander of the fort. He spoke Russian and he became their interpreter, and eventually they even armed him because he became a guard to the commander of the fort. And he had access to go in and out. The other story that I'm completely skipping is the way they built the fort. They had 7 compounds, and the commander's house was up on a hill. That's where the commander's was, and they put another fort around that house, and then they had a trail with a fort going down to the main compounds of the Russian fort. And then they had, that was the only place you could get water. Today it's not there, it was a spring water. So they built a fort around that water. But he had access, he came and went. He was the boss, my uncle called him the boss. Straw boss is what he called him. He had command of the Aleuts, Chugach that went out to get food. He had the command of the gardeners, the agricultural experiment the Russians were doing. They grew potatoes, and that was where I grew up, putting the same kind of ground, using the same kind of ground, and planting potatoes like the Russians taught my people. That's where I lived. And Tanu stayed there. He lived there with them, and he worked his way up to the point where he was pretty much the commander of many of the small work groups. They tell stories about how they felt when they first brought the cows in, and they named the place Khasbud Nelly Bud-E, the stomach of the cow. It's a small inlet. They named that place according to what the Russians brought. But as the years went by, the Russians became meaner and meaner and meaner and very disrespectful to the people. And the Tlingits are real proud people. They took their children away and they said, we'll put them in school. But they took them in as slaves in Russia, in Siberia. They took some of the women, they made prostitutes out of them, and they were wives of noblemen that they took and made prostitutes out of them. And they became more disgruntled. One of the last things they did was they have, and Judy will get into times and years and geography better than I. They closed down the creek where they got the fish and forbid the natives of getting their own food from there. And the second winter they were afraid they were going to have starvation because that's their main diet, was the dried salmon. And the last insult was Tanuk's uncle died and he was an Ift. He was a shaman. And they usually put your shaman up on stilts, and they're usually dry. They have all of these little houses. And when he was building his uncle's coffin, there was a driftwood he picked up and he used the nails on his uncle's coffin. there was one Russian leader that was one of the most hateful men that they've ever seen. He eventually was relieved from his job, but what he did lingered with them. And this one went over to the man's grave, the shaman's grave, and he said, "You stole our nails. This is the nails that we use, you stole them." So they took the corpse of the shaman, Tanuk's uncle, and they chopped his hands off and they chopped the corpse's feet off. And that was what really did it for Tanuk. That's when he decided that he would clean the place of the Russians. I'm going to skip a whole bunch of other stories. His uncle that raised him was the one that manned the platforms and the wharf where the Russians came in from the Russian lake, our lake, they would have a whole bunch of boats, and they would bring it up to this platform, a wharf and then a lower platform. They'd have uniforms pull up on there, and the allies that worked for them would come down from the dock, and they would pitch the fish out into their buckets and carry them on. And Tanuk would be there supervising all this. And the other people, the cook usually worked in the garden. And this was in August, and if you've ever been to Yakutat area, berries, there's a lot of berries. We have strawberries blooming, and at that time salmon berries were ripe. And they sent the Chugach and the Aleut men out for strawberries. And the cook they hated too came out of the fort, and he sat down, he was chopping wood. And they were ready. Tanuk said, "I am going to say hello to the commander, and I want my brother-in-law, Tlngit, that's carried in Nellie's family that name from that place." That was his brother-in-law. And he had two younger brothers that he put down on the dogs, brother-in-laws. They were very young, my father says. So they must have been teenagers. And my grandma Sarah says they were twins, young boys, but they were his brother-in-laws. He put them down by the dogs, where they brought in the fish with his uncle, Joshua. He was a famous bad warrior up there. If the Tlingit had a name for a pirate, that's what they would call Joshua. And he was down on the docks, and Tanuk said, and the boys' names was Witzat and Sala'a. They were Iyak names anyway. Very young, they left them down at the dock, and he took the Tlingit with him. And when he struck the commander around the table, the man had just offered him snuff in a large snuff can, and the commander put it back in his pocket. And Tanuk probably got rattled, because when he first struck the commander, he struck the snuff can, and Steve can tell you where that snuff can is. It's at the museum in Juneau. So the fight went on. Tanuk had what the men called Tlngit, it hangs around your neck, and the knife with the double-bladed knife is on your side, and that was to hand-to-man combat that Tanuk and the men used. And we still have that. We still have that warrior's knife. He missed the first time, and the commander was a really big man, and he was trying to drag Tanuk to his table where his sword was. He wasn't armed when Tanuk struck him. he was not armed, so he was trying to drag him to where his sword was. And Tlngit decided he was going to make a break for it. And the Russians had double walls and double doors, enough for a man to run in between. And he ran in between those doors. And when the commander came after him, he struck with a sword from between the two walls and just about cut the commander in half. And then he let out the war cry. When he let out the war cry was a signal for the men that was watching the cook that was eating salmon berries and chopping wood. They came to him and they said, "Shnada." They said it means Fred or something in what they learned from the Russians. "Here is your dessert." And the man sat down, big man, and it's a man they hated too, very bad, mean man. He put his feet on top of each other like this. And when the war cry came, the men that were there had double axes. They started to strike him and he looked back, so they caught him right by his ankles and cut his feet off. And then they killed him. Then they killed the people that were in the potato farming. And then Shruak and the twin boys saw the first skiff coming in with fish. And the young boys put on the Almute ladies' clothes. They were the ones that cleaned the fish. So the Russians didn't think anything about it. They came right to shore with their fish. And that was where they killed the men that were in the boats with the fish. And then they would put on the uniforms. If you're familiar with Yakutat, there's an island across from where this battle is going on. Every springtime when we go there, there's those brown bears having their early clam digging. There's huge brown bears that live across there. And there's an area there where when you get into the Anka River system, when the tide is low, there's falls of slush. And one night my father was taking us there. My mother was in Tacoma Hospital with my sister. And they put me, I don't know why they did it, they put me into a round bottom canoe and my father was towing it. And Mira and my older sister was with me and I was wiggling so much, I turned it over right at that falls. I turned that canoe over. So good thing I had long hair, because when I went under, my hair came up and it cramped my hair. But that's that falls. And when they kidnapped the wife and the two children, that's that area they took them to, when they were grabbing the kidnapping. I want to apologize to all the people that don't understand English, that I refer a lot of this into Tlingit so much. It is really difficult to put it into English. English is so inadequate. And I'm sorry that I have to stop because there's two other people that are speaking after me. I want to thank every one of you that's here. Tlngit Isan, you could teach those of you that are here from another place, like Teslin and the Canadians, many that have traveled. We are really glad you are here so that we can share a little bit of the history that has not been written. And I hope that as you go home to your homes, you will be blessed with a cheers.
I'm going to the PowerPoint's not working, so I'll just have to read it. Sorry, but the name of the presentation was Our Grandfathers Won. And what it means to us is that we killed the Russians and they never came back. But it all is, my brother, when he talks about it, he likes to call it Independence Day. Because one of the things that we get mad about is, well, what the heck? Russia sold Alaska to, what right did they have to sell it, right? Because we drove them out of Yakutat, they never came back, and what right did they have to sell Yakutat? That kind of irks us, but they don't have the right to sell it, right? The name of the site in Russian is, I can't speak Russian, but it's Novorossiyak. I don't know what to say. How do you say it? But we have our own names for it, and on one of the slides I had listed the names of the Tlingit names for this area, and it's Anushinu. The other name that we have for the site is the Clouds People Town, and it's a National Historic Site. And the way this project got started was in 2005, we had the 200th anniversary of the Battle of Yakutat, as we call it. And we do have a small grant from National Park Service, but we've been too busy to finish it. But one of these days, between my mother and I, when I can get her settled down and just lock her in a room to write it down, that's the only way we're going to get it done. But the way I wanted to start my story is about the prophecy about this. It says, long before the coming of the white man, Tlngit, the prophetess or shaman, prophesied the coming of the white man. She was a powerful female shaman. She was the descendant of Kits.adi shaman. Her yake, song, and chant is in Chimshian. Tlngit was born and raised on Knight Island in Yakutat Bay. She was from the Raven Moiety, Kashkakwan, Owl House, and Bones of the Raven House. That's my Tlingit name, is Tlngit. While very young, Tlngit received her yake or helping spirit. She gave the magical arrow to her brother Yakutat who became the Kashkakwan clan chief. This magical arrow never missed its mark. Shortly before the coming of the first Europeans during one of her out-of-body journeys, one of her yakes brought her a message. When the sun reaches that position, you will hear a voice. At the designated time, they heard a canoe or spirit canoe in a voice that seemed to echo through the tops of the smoke from their community houses. After she came out of her trance, Tlngit told the people, moving villages floating in the ocean will soon be visiting us. And that was the prophecy. At the time of the European and Russian contact in the mid-18th century, the Tlingit and Eyak people occupied the Gulf Coast of Alaska between Latuya Bay and Controlla Bay. The first recorded Russian contact came in 1741 when the Danish captain Vitus Bering visited St. Elias. And if you look up St. Elias, he's the prophet Elijah. Tlingit oral history recounts the story when some Kagwantan men first encountered a white woman who survived a shipwreck north of Yakutat near Icy Bay. The men who followed her followed the tracks of two other survivors who had apparently fallen in a glacier crevice and died. She became the wife of one of the men and lived with the Tlingits until she became very old and died. Another first encounter was said to have taken place at Latuya Bay, and he mentioned that, La Perouse. This encounter between Yehoram and the captain of the schooner is related through a song composed by Kawas. A long time ago, Yeh lived in the town of Latuya. Yeh lived in a stone cave. Yeh sat on a stone stool. Yeh heard the voice of the captain of the schooner. Lower a lifeboat and a cask of wine and take it to Yeh. Yeh sensed evil and summoned his strongest spirits. Yeh gave an order, turn them into stone. Boat and cask of wine, men and oars turned to stone near the shore where you'll see them. Near the shore, the rocks in Latuya. Yeh again heard the voice of the captain order, lower a boat and cask of wine and take it to Yeh. Ye sat in a stone cave, ye sat on a stone stool and watched. They landed and took off the cast, and they brought it to him. They opened it and dipped in a dipper and gave it to him. They gave him a third and then a fourth, and soon it was half empty. Soon it was empty. Only then did he began to feel the euphoric effects. They started to tap the rhythm on the stone floors of Ye sat in his stone cave. Ye sat on his stone stool, Ye sang and chanted, and there's a chant that goes with this. When the Tlingits at the trio first encountered the first European ship, they thought it was a raven from mythology coming back. This first encounter was said to have happened soon after a canoe full of Indians were wrecked at the dangerous entrance to the bay, and bags of fur floated out to the sea and were picked up by the ship. When the ship sailed into the bay, it looked like to the Tlingit 2 great birds with white wings like the mythological white raven coming back. And in fear, the Tlingit fled to the woods. After they came out of the woods, they looked at the ship through tubes of rolled up skunk cabbage leaves, because they believed if they looked directly at raven, they might turn into stone. Then a nearly blind old man said his life was behind him and volunteered to go to the ship to see if his raven really turned men into stone. He visited the ship and returned to shore laden with gifts of food. They decided it must be ships and people and not ravens, so the Indians visited the ships and traded with fur. The next recorded visit was in 1788 with Ishmaelioth and Hakrov, and the 3 saints visited Yakutat Bay, presented the chiefs with the copper Russian crest. They also visited Dry Bay and Tui Bay, and that's another long story. One of the other earliest encounters was in 1793 when a hunting party under the command of 4 Russian Komishki visited Yakutat. The following year, a party of 500 Badarkas hunted near Yakutat. Voronov decided to establish the trading post and agriculture experimental colony in Yakutat. Hannibal said negotiations for the land began in 1794, and I think that's the worst place in the world you could establish archaeological. At this time, the village at Port Mulgrave was established to take advantage of the visiting schooners. 2 Russian ships, after 2 years' voyage from Kamchatka, reached Kodiak in August of 1794 with supplies including seeds, cattle, and colonists. They were bound for Yakutat and other posts. Now, this story about the cattle, when we were looking up a story of one of the clans, which is the cowhide house, people were saying, well, there's never cows, but there were cows in Yakutat. So that's probably where that name comes from. Relations between the Tlingit and Russians were delicate. When Voronov went to Hinchinbrook Island in 1795 with Kodiak Islanders, a party of Tlingit warriors on a raiding party against the Chugach Eskimo attacked him. Voronov sent Plolomishionoi to Yakutat in 1795 to select a site and begin building and planting different kinds of grains and vegetables. Insignia Churtovich was responsible for the hunters and protecting the colonists. Voronov was in Nuchuk when he found out many of the natives in the Russian service had fled Yakutat because they were afraid of the Tlingit. After punishing the Kits.adi, who had led the retreat, he cut off half his beard. Voronov went to Yakutat, and Tepnikov wrote, on his arrival in Yakutat in August, Voronov induced many tribes of savages who were hostile to the Russians to enter into friendly relations with them and hoisted to a pole the flag coat of arms of Russia amid firings of guns, beating of drums, and shouting hurrahs, when according to his report, all of Voronov's people formed in line and went through military evolutions. So they were good at, the relations were good at the beginning. In the spring of 1795, Voronov attempted to send settlers to Yakutat because of the shortage of fresh water. They returned to Kodiak. In the fall, he returned to Yakutat on the Ogla. He took the chief's son or nephew as a hostage and left Takrana 5 Plomishini, 2 settlers, 3 Kodiakans, and the Ali's interpreter. And that's when they spent the difficult winter in Yakutat. That's when he did that trek up the coast. In the following of June 1796, a hunting party arrived in Yakutat, and at the end of June, a ship with the settlers arrived. In July or August, when Voronov arrived, he picked a site for settlement he named New Russia. The fort was built at the mouth of a small stream and a settlement for around 80 people that included settlers and hunters. Dauenhauer set out building huts for the settlers and hunters and the construction of the barracks and the storehouse. Relations between the Yakutat Tlingit and the Russians at the beginning seemed to be good, as shown by Dave Lewin, as says, appeared before him with a large armed number of people with the customary ceremonies, fully armed and dancing and singing. In proof of their sincerity, the chief, to assure Dauenhauer, sent his own children and relatives as hostages. On account of his great age, the chief or relative was chosen as a place, and upon his request, a diplomat signed by Dauenhauer was given him as token of the power bestowed upon him. Dauenhauer described the fort as a wooden palisade and 3 batteries surrounded by a moat. The settlement had a hut with 2 lean-to sheds, one of which was fortified and had a battery. In addition, the settlement stood a storehouse for clothes for keeping of provisions, a blacksmith shop, a kitchen, a smokehouse, a bath, and barracks. Davidson also noted the Russian posts outside the settlement. Dahl and Baker described the fort as 7 buildings inside a stockade with 5 more outside the walls. Also mentioned was a fortified position or outlook post on an island in the lagoon, a lighthouse keeper at Ocean Cape guards at the barrier at Tawa Creek, and abandoned posts inside Cape's pits. So in the fall of 1796, Dauenhauer set off in the expedition to explore up the coast to Copper River, and he notes all the settlements up the coast. When Dauenhauer returned in June of 1797, he found that 30 settlers died of scurvy during the winter of 1796, and the 2 leaders of the fort were feuding. As noted, the 2 overseers stationed at different localities were continued quarrel and strife. And in 1799, in August, Talon picked up the Plumishinoi's family and the first collected at Yakutat. Their ship was wrecked in the Tlngit area, and the whole family drowned. And Talon survived, and all the furs except 400 were saved. So he had gone to Kits.adi to protest the conditions at Yakutat, but it had been ordered back to his post by Dauenhauer's representative, and it was on his way back to Yakutat. Dauenhauer appointed Nikolai Monkin in his place. He had also told that 15 more colonists had died from eating certain herbs, so they had already lost like 30, 45 colonists by this time. And by this time, he had established the fort in Yakutat. And he had visited Yakutat in 1799 with 500 Bidarkas. At Cape Suckling, 30 Bidarkas were lost in the storm, and here the Tlingits attacked them and killed or captured some 92 Aleuts. And then this is when the Russian fort at Sitka was destroyed, and it's also recorded the story when the Tlingits were attacking, that this whole plan of when all the chiefs had got together at the Angoon area and decided to do a joint attack in all these areas, and that a chief from one of the village at Prince of Wales Islands had furnished guns, powders, and even cannons. So this is when they went from Kodiak to Yakutat with a fleet of 450 Bidarkas. 60 Bidarkas went to Akko, and a large number of the Tlingits attacked and beat them. So this is the attack at Dry Bay. So this is it, but we have one of the stories that was recorded by Elaine, was the Olaf Abrahams story and version of the Yakutat attack. So she told you some of the reasons why they attacked is because they were being mistreated. They were blocking their fishing routes. They had placed a huge underwater door across the water. They had to pack their belongings all the way around these over the land to get to their fishing camps, and they were being mistreated. And this is they say the Russians started the trouble, the reasons why they killed them all. And when in his story, this is only 2 Russian men escaped. The watchman who was at what is now Ocean Cape, who was the keeper of the lighthouse, another watchman that was watching the blockade on Opa Creek, a place where Russians were blocking the stream to prevent the Tlingit from maintaining fish. He too was forgotten. He talks about Tanukh and why they were punished because he had built that coffin for his uncle. And he talks also in the story about the Russians' leader house, who was built at a distance from the others from the Russian fort. So these stories indicate there were two places, the Russian fort and another place. And the Russian leader had his place at a distance from the Russian fort. And he talks about the story that my mom was talking about, how he almost didn't kill him. And the other one was when he was chopping the wood, and they gave him berries and they cut his feet off. And it says that most of the Russian men were out fishing at the time, but later they killed everyone in the fort. Once they got in the buildings, they dressed as the clothing of the Russians. And later it says when the Russians came in from Kodiak, they did not see the house on the hill, which is the Russian captain's fort. And the man that was forgotten in Ocean Cave signals, they picked him up before coming into Yakutat. After he told them what happened, the ship turned around. So Rezanov wrote in 1806 that the Russians killed some 40 people in the fort were 2 3-pound brass guns, two iron 1-pound guns, and 1/2-pound iron guns with ammunition, 5 pounds of powder. Rezanov added that by Alexander they learned everyone was killed except 8 men, 2 women, and 3 men who were absent and now prisoners of the EF. There's a lot of other stories that happened, more stories that happened afterwards. When the Tlingits went up to the Chugach area, they were going to attack the Chugach, and a lot of their, like 200 warriors were killed off after this. There's also the story about the fort that was established on the Sitak River, which is how that got destroyed by the glacier. There's also the story, one story about the woman that left the fort and went to Sitka and became, she's involved in the Sitka story. But we named one of our plants, and my brother and David were involved with a unique plant they called the moonort fern, which was discovered in Yakutat. It's pretty rare and only unique to the Yakutat area, was named Tanu. And the other plant that's with that is called Yakutat. So we do have some memory of him, and that's why we named these stories. But this is just a beginning of the project that we're working on, and I'm going to pass this around, which is going to be one of the slides that was on there, which is Take Ish, our shaman with the Russian sword cane, which is now in the Anchorage Museum. So, finished cheese, thank you.
Without further ado, I wanted to introduce the last speaker in this session. Elena Piterskaya is from the Institute of Ethnology and Anthropology in Moscow, Russia, and I apologize for not getting a chance to visit with her prior to this, so I really only know 2 things about her, and one is that she was the very first person to register for this conference. Andy and I we had put the word out about this conference, and we were wondering if anyone had heard about it because we hadn't gotten any response, and suddenly this registration form shows up from Moscow, so we knew that we got our message out. And the other thing is that she traveled the furthest to get here, so we really do appreciate you coming all this way and taking the time and the expense to get here. So without further ado, Elena Piterskaya.
Good afternoon, dear elders, dear organizers, dear guests. It's a great honor for me to be here and make a presentation, especially after such outstanding researches. I'd like to once again thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me here, and not just for providing an opportunity to make a presentation, but to give a chance to get in touch with Tlingit culture and to listen authentic Tlingit language. And I'm sorry for my English, it's not my native. The aim of my presentation is not to tell what Tlingit history was about, but to present objective materials and data analysis that we gain from sources that today are available in Russian. And I will be grateful for all comments because I understand that they can only enrich my research and guide me in the future. Already for almost 2 centuries, American Northwest Coast is a region of special interest for Russian researchers. And today already lots of works published on history, politics, geographical issues, and economy of former Russian colonies in North America. But most attention is still paid to the ethnographic study of the Northwest Coast and especially to areas traditionally inhabited by Tlingit people. And today in my presentation, I'd like to focus on Tlingit interaction with other Aboriginal groups of the Northwest Coast and Inner Alaska in traditional and early colonial period. And we'll analyze trade contacts because, to my mind, it was through the trade when Tlingit exchanged various cultural elements with other ethnic groups of the region. And I think that this work can also help to reflect that complex network of connections, of cultural and economic ties that existed in the region long before first Europeans appeared in this area. In my presentation, I will not cover Tlingit contacts with Russians because it is a separate huge topic and it was already paid much attention today. And I will not focus my attention on Tlingit interaction with Europeans, with other Europeans, but naturally we will consider that cultural contacts that existed under the conditions of the Russian colonization and American and English influence in the region. This issue was already described by several American and Russian researchers, but many of them paid most attention to Tlingit contacts with Russians, Americans, and Englishmen. And today I try to analyze them from the point of view of mutual influence of Aboriginal groups on each other. My presentation is based on published and non-published archival sources that are available today in Russia. Among published works, most important were the memories of early travelers, Navy officers, personal and business correspondence of the Russian-American company employees, and also the works of Orthodox missionaries. Some of the documents today are published separately as separate works, like the works of Veniaminov. Some are included into the collection or sets of different documents that are published on Russian exploration of North Pacific and Russian occupation on Aleut Islands and Alaska. First of all, for my research, I used official reports and notes of colonial administration to the board of Russian-American company, to the Russian state authorities and Russian-American company shareholders. And these materials include correspondence of mainly Baranov, Khlebnikov, and Wrangel. And also I used the descriptions and notes of early Russian travelers and military men such as Golovnin, Lysyansky, Davydov, Litke, and some others. And works of Orthodox missionaries, first of all of Ioan Veniaminov. I also involved the works of early historians that used documentary materials that today to a much extent are lost already, and first of all it is the works of Tikhmenyov. As for the unpublished materials, today most of the documentary records are kept in largest Russian archives, that is Russian State Historical Archive, Russian Navy Archive, Archive of Foreign Policy of the Russian Empire, and some others. Though ethnographic study of American Northwest Coast has a very long history in Russian academic science, still most of the Russian researchers use written documentary records. We definitely use them, but understand that they are very dubious, especially in such a sensitive issue as contacts with Aboriginal groups. And we consider their subjective nature and often negative attitude of Russian people, of Russian sailors, Russian pромышленники, Russian fur traders towards the Aboriginal population of the area. It was also quite often that Russian American company employees either exaggerated the facts or misinterpreted and tried to hide the deeds of the Russian hunters and Russian American company employees and to hide their real social and political situation in the colony just to make better impression on the company's shareholders and state authorities. Many of them, like some of the missionaries, misinterpreted the facts because of lack of knowledge of Aboriginal languages and peculiarities of their culture. But during several last decades, more and more Russian researchers also turned to the oral history materials as one of the primary sources of information for ethnography and the historical reconstruction of Tlingit society. But as I already mentioned, this presentation will be limited only to written records. There is also another important source for studying the topic of Tlingit interaction with other Aboriginal groups of the region, and it is the museum collection. It was already mentioned today that in St. Petersburg, in Kunstkamera, or Museum of Ethnography and Anthropology, we have the richest collection of different Tlingit items, cultural objects, and many of them were brought to Russia by Voznesensky, who brought various Tlingit women jewelry, Tlingit robes, different carpets, smoking pipes, dishes, masks, even a set of festival dress. I have some pictures, but they are in PowerPoint, so I'm not able to show them today. Also, why museum collections are very important for the reconstruction of the cultural interaction in the region, because we can vividly see what cultural objects were brought into this or that area from other. For instance, in this collection that Voznesensky brought to St. Petersburg Museum, there are several things like spoons, smoking pipes that were acquired by him at the Tlingit area, but they are definitely of Haida or Tsimshan origin. So, as for the contacts themselves, I'd like to start with the traditional period, and to my mind, it is reasonable to divide all contacts into two main categories. It is peaceful contacts with other groups and armed conflicts for the purpose of acquisition of valuable goods. But anyway, both of these types of contacts, they have the same economic foundation. Many historians recognize excellent entrepreneurial skills of Tlingit, and today, according to Russian records, we can trace that Tlingit extended their trading routes simultaneously in several directions, and the territory of their active trade was not limited to the area of their traditional living, but extended to British Columbia, Upper Yukon, and Mackenzie Valley. Most active contacts with tribes of Inner Alaska had Tlingits from Chilkat, Stikine, and Takokwan, through whose territories lie the most comfortable ways to the Athapascan groups of Tutchen, Tagish, and Tautan. Occasional contacts occurred with Athena group and later with Tanana and Han Athapascan. Tlingit trading goods included basketry, wooden boxes, herbs, fish oil, tantalum shells, which they in their turn brought from Haida, who gained them mostly at Vancouver Island. Tlingit paid with wool and processed skins of caribou and moose, which they in their turn acquired from Athapascan. Main products Tlingit acquired from Athabaskan groups were fur, moose and caribou skins, and also clothing and boots made of chamois with traditional Athabaskan decorations. For instance, in Vesnesensky collection, among items he collected from Yakutat Tlingit in 1840, we found various boots made in Athabaskan style, and in the same collection there is a blanket made of moose skin acquired by him in 1844 with obvious Athabaskan influence. Athabaskan groups from Copper River exported copper to northwest coast, from which Tlingit craftsmen made knives, arrows, jewelry, and highly valued copper plates. Part of copper Tlingit acquired from Athabaskan they sold in their turn to Haida and Tsimshan in exchange for slaves, jewelry, and crafts. Copper River people produced axes, knives, breast pieces for themselves and for the trade with Ayak, Tlingit, and other groups, and this how copper moved to south areas. Except foreign trade, so-called foreign trade with inner Alaska groups, Tlingit major trading partners included also northwest coast tribes. For instance, Tlingit of Chilkat sold Tsimshan and Haida their Chilkat blankets. Tlingit from Yakutat, Sika, and Hunakwan traded mainly basketry. Tsimshan traded spoons made of horns of mountain sheep and ritual hats. Tlingit had very close connection with Ayak, with whom they sometimes shared hunting areas and had joint feasts, potlatch, and even weddings. Because of a very short time, I'm not quoting each time, and I'm not referring to the source as soon as I quote. But contacts with Ayak people were very detailedly described by the monk Nikolai, and they are published in a set of documents devoted to the presence of Russian missionaries in Russian America. As a result of long-term neighborhood of different ethnic groups in a very close territory and their close trade and economic cooperation, they all experienced intensive mutual cultural influence. For instance, Pacific Eskimo fall under the strong influence of Tenaina Indians and Tlingit. Ayak was the group that experienced strongest Tlingit influence. Athabaskan groups has acquired many Tlingit cultural elements such as games, some rituals, some ceremonies, and even art, elements peculiar for northwest coast. Athabaskan group Taltan, Tagish, and Southern Tuchen acquired matrilinear clan system of Tlingit. Trade contact between Tlingit and Athabaskan groups boosted the development of slavery among Athabaskan. But in turn, Athabaskan influence on Tlingit was limited only by the acquisition of some clothing elements and boots, which sometimes Tlingit traded further with the Russians. As a result of Tlingit trade expansion, some Athabaskan groups and Ayak has acquired words from Tlingit language and incorporated into their native. As for the colonial period, though it's I don't think that the word colonial could be really applied to the Tlingit people. In Russian ethnographic literature devoted to the people of Russian America during the Russian occupation of Alaska, main attention is mainly paid to two-way contacts between Russians and the Aboriginal population of Alaska, as if such intercultural contacts were the only that happened at Alaska at that period. But as we can see from various Russian sources, Tlingit people, even under the strong Russian presence in the region, they still preserve their exclusive rights for the mediator trade with other Aboriginal groups of the region. And the sphere of the interaction included both indigenous people and newcomers, Russians. And as we can see, the cultural interaction did not stop under the influence of Russians, but it even dynamically developed and acquired new features not peculiar to the earlier trade contacts. Introduction of new goods and strong demand for manufactured European goods prompted the establishment of long-term trade and economic ties and enhanced cross-cultural exchange. At the beginning of the 19th century, Tlingit acquired strong mediator position and conducted trade operations with Europeans, including Russians, people of the northwest coast, and people of inner Alaska. American and Englishmen provided Tlingit with firearms and even cannons in exchange for the fur of the sea otter. Development of trade with Europeans boosted the dissemination of iron among Tlingit, from which they produced knives, hooks, carving instruments that could be sold further to other groups. Main European trading partners of Tlingit included Russian pромышленники, Russian hunters and fur traders, Russian-American company employees, American and English captains, and starting with the 1830s, Hudson Bay Company agents. Contacts with Europeans led to the changes in the assortment in that variety of goods that Tlingit traditionally required from Athabascan tribes. Now fur became the most significant trading item. And since now European goods of high importance are iron pots, manufactured blankets, knives, tobacco, baking flour, tea, coffee, but still most valuable are fire guns and black powder. Trade with Europeans was of high importance for Tlingit, who received goods not only for their internal consumption, but which could be used during the exchange with other Tlingit clans and other tribes of Alaska. The majority of European goods Tlingit received from Russians, they received for food, including potato, which skills they again accepted from Russians. Tlingit did not sell Russians furs because of very low prices that Russian-American company could pay for them. So they preferred to trade furs with American and Englishmen, demanding or requiring alcohol, guns, and cannons. Tlingit interaction at the early colonial period had several stages or levels. For instance, Tlingit of Sitka Kwan bought furs from other Kwans and sold them to Europeans. Chilkat Kwan, Tlingit, and Sticking Kwan traded with inner Alaska Indians and exercised control over the main trading paths into inner Alaska areas. And for more than 5 decades, Tlingit were the only trading mediators between Europeans and other Aboriginal population of Alaska. Because in 1820s, 1830s, Tlingit were mainly interested in furs of sea otter, naturally, and also in the furs of fox and sable. They required Athabascan tribes to increase fur hunting that led to the considerable expansion of Tlingit trading routes and trading contacts. During the trading operation, different parties used Chinook language as a trading one that initially integrated words from the languages of different Aboriginal Alaskan languages, and later also incorporated words from French, Russian, and English. And I will not especially focus on the role of manufactured European goods, but still there are very interesting descriptions in Russian sources, for instance in the work of Wrangel, where he describes the dependence of Aboriginal population of Alaska on the tea and coffee that Russians and Americans brought to them. And also just a small note on the cultural change that occurred within Tlingit culture as a result of the interaction with Aleut and Kadiak Eskimo, who were brought by Russians as members of various hunting brigades or hunting teams to the areas of where Tlingit lived. In the middle 19th century, the situation has slightly changed because Haida started their own trading mediator role without any involvement of Tlingit population. They also acquired from Russians potato growing skills and very soon started to produce as much potato that it became possible to sell it in large quantities to Europeans and to Russians themselves. And Haida Kagani were the most active trading group who interacted with Russians in Archangel, Novoarkhangivsk, during the fairs that were arranged from time to time. And in records of Khlebnikov we can find the description how at these fairs, at these bazaars or marketplaces, various people met. We also need to remember that Russian American company employees consisted not only of Russians, they were represented also by Finnish, Dutchmen, they were also represented by Germans, there were several people from Aboriginal population of Siberia, and so for such markets Tlingit came, Haida came, and it was really a multicultural environment. And as a conclusion, I'd like to say that before Russians sold Alaska, its Aboriginal culture represented the whole very complex cultural conglomerate that was represented by the combination of traditional Aboriginal cultural elements, manufactured European goods, and traditional items that were changed and modernized under the European influence. And I don't want to say that Russians were good guys, but but they did not destroy that stable system of interaction, of trade patterns that existed at Alaska and Northwest Coast long before they appeared here. Thanks for your attention.